our guest is Al Santoli, professor at IWP, president of the Asia America Initiative, New York Times best-selling author, and Pulitzer-nominated author. Al, welcome to the show.
Yeah, well, given all the stuff with the Pulitzer the past few years, I don't know if that's a compliment or a insult.
Well, let's take it as a compliment. Delighted to have you here today to talk. Our topic is the value of practical experience in education. And just to contextualize it, at IWP we have the scholar-practitioner model.
Yes.
And everyone on our faculty has done things. It's not just like pure academics. I mean, we are academics, but people have also done things. And it really gives a different kind of texture to the education here. If you want to study covert action, for example, well, we have the former deputy director of the National Clandestine Service who can teach you about covert action. You want to talk about the National Security Council? Well, we have a senior executive who on the NSC staff for 10 years. You want to talk about counter-terrorism? We have several people, including myself, who have backgrounds in the counter-terrorism field. And I mean, this just is how IWP is. We have people who've actually done the thing. So it's not just theories that someone dreamed up or some fresh PhD you never heard of who's never done anything. We have the people who've actually done it. And so given that, I want you to talk about, if we could, start with kind of your background and what you've done and sort of your field experience before coming to IWP.
Okay. Well, I've been here in the campus for 22 years now. And the relationships with Dr. Linchowski and a lot of the original faculty like Ken DeGraffenreid, Michelle Van Cleef, who both came from the intelligence, counterintelligence side of government. Mm-hmm. And Michelle I knew when we were colleagues in Congress and the House of Representatives. It stems from the sense of duty. And also, we all were a part at that time of the Reagan administration in one form or another, and felt it kind of a duty that since John was making the sacrifice to start a new school based on the legacy of winning the Cold War, or at that time, at least preventing a nuclear war, and that was a big deal. For some of us who had other types of roles within or adjunct to the administration, for me, I was part of Team B, which were kind of like ninjas, kind of like the old OSS, that all of us in that group we were all volunteers. Very few got paid, but we all knew our parts of the world where we had a lot of experience or lived. For me, it was Southeast Asia.
Going back to the Vietnam War.
Yeah.
And
yes, exactly,
you fought.
Jim. And also was doing a lot of refugee work. And there were others who had the relationships with Latin America or Africa, Europe, different parts of Europe and other places, that we brought with us a context, much like with the Team B, which was like the Office of Strategic Services of World War II, where those people were like adjunct intelligence service, but they lived their normal lives too. and they had their relationships and they had their ongoing ties to the countries that they were being looked upon as expert analysts, because those were the places that were like their second homes, and they knew the people. And there was so much cultural intelligence, as we would call it now, going on, because everyone within those groups lived it.
Right.
And kind of that's where I came from. I had worked Afghanistan for a number of years. In between my one life as a writer, another life going into the human rights and refugee protection situation at the toughest, hardest years of the Cold War, when there were so many refugees from the Soviet Union or the East-West struggle going on, that it integrated into all the academic work that I was also doing, and the independent study I was doing. To do history books, you have to know the history, you have to know the geography, you have to know the cultural and kind of the anthropological psychology of places. So it was always an integrated study that I was doing from the time I got out of the military, even when I was in the military, when I was 18, 19 years old, up even till now. I'm constantly learning, because that love of learning never leaves you. And I know, as you're teaching now also, Jim, you hope that that kind of is contagious for your students at whatever level they're at.
Yes. Well, an important point that you make, that from the beginning, IWP was a haven for scholar practitioners. In fact, that was the whole point of it.
Yes.
That founded by former Reagan administration, in most cases, officials who wanted to bring that practical knowledge of how the Cold War was won into an educational setting, and other schools just weren't cutting it. I know that Dr. Lanchowski, our founder and former president, was teaching at Georgetown, and they just weren't as interested in that kind of methodology. So he and others left there and founded this school. So you were in on that, right in at the creation, essentially.
I was, I think you would say, the second step. The first step was getting the school started and the relationship with Boston University as a kind of DC campus. And then the sacrifice, because it is a lot of sacrifice, not just to start a small business, but an academic institution. There are no givens and there are no guarantees. And the whole adventure, as you know, Dr. Lanchowski's father was a very well-known academic in University of California, at a huge institution. And between the influence and the example of his father, and John's appreciation of having practitioners as well as scholars working together, it turned out to be a very good chemistry.
Yeah. So what are, in your opinion, the value of practitioners in academia? What's so good about having people with practical experience?
Instinct, intuition. Because if you're a practitioner, or if you're in business, in my case, I'm still in places that some people would call ungovernable territories. I've been connected one way or another to China since I was in elementary school. And I believed that my life would somehow be involved in dealing with people who had a very long memory, sense of history. That would be the Chinese, but there's also for other people here who are a Central Asian expert, that would be the Turks. Other people, that would be the Polish and the Austro-Hungarians and the Germanic tribes. And you can go on with America's a young country. And many people who came here came with a vision, a dream, and an aspiration for their children to be able to succeed beyond them, coming from humble origins. And for those of us that have the scholarship that we appreciate the rise and fall of empires, there's no such thing as the end of history. And I mean, Mark Twain had a lot of very good statements of in his time at, the end of the 19th century, when people talked about things like end of history, and Twain would just get right back in them and lampoon them with his sense of humor, saying, oh, there may not be connections in history, but there certainly are hiccups.
Right.
That sound pretty much alike. Because these things, human nature never ends. It's positive and negative sides. And as a practitioner, and especially, I'll say in my work, because I'm dealing with cultures and have for the past, I hate to say this, because in my American way, we look at this always fresh, new, younger, creative perspective. I've done this for over 50 years, and starting when I was 18, when I was a young soldier, and got put into a unit that was a special operations unit, but it was it was in the legacy of Merrill's Marauders of World War II, as
Yes.
I later found. In fact, recently, I just found that at a conference we held on IWP that was about one of my mentors, General Ed Lansdale, and the independence of the Philippines, which President Eisenhower has put him in charge of. And I could never figure out, except that, General Lansdale was in one of my books after I had been in the military, and he knew my sense of seeing things through culture. And how can we say this? The basic human needs, like the psychiatrist Maslow has that pyramids of human needs. I always see things that way, just naturally. And it's the same way that I teach. I try to get to know each student. What is their talent? What is their direction? And is there anything that they don't see in themselves? The way in me, Lansdale, after we had finished the book, he said, well, come on over. Have coffee. I've got some people I want you to meet. And he had this idea or this instinct that eventually I would wind up in the Philippines. And it was like, really? And I said, I'm not going to the Philippines. There's no way. I have no inclination. And then it turns out, after the war on terror started, which was, 2001, 2002, which is 20 years later, what Lansdale saw in me was real, and I started remembering these things that he taught me. And his team, And because as a practitioner, he could see things in me that I couldn't see in myself because I had my own immediate needs that I wanted to fulfill and aspirations. But I feel that with every human being, we have paths that we follow. That is our life. And you might stray and you might go around. It's like Robert Frost's poem of The Road Not Taken. And eventually, you always come back to the road. Even if you go off on these side passageways or these little tributaries that go into the forest, you wind up back on the road. And you have guides and mentors and advisors that remind you of that. They're just in your life because that's the story of your life. And they play that role of reminding you or opening your eyes to things that eventually, at some point, will become part of who you are. And that's how I look at teaching.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, as academics, we have a responsibility to our students.
You know what's interesting, because kind of the style that I became known for as a writer was oral history. And my kind of role model was Studs Terkel in Chicago, who wrote books like Working and other things, very humanistic, very Americana. And he came across as this gruff old guy. You know, you'd think he was like a teamster or a dock worker or something, because that was his persona, was every man. And I would go to an academic conference at that time when people were using my books in a lot of schools. And professors would say, "Oh, that's Studs Terkel. You know, he specializes in anecdotes. He's not a real historian." And it's like, well, wait a minute. Nobody's reading your stuff, but millions of people are reading and learning from him. So, where are we disconnecting here? And with me, they saw me as very young. I was, in my early 30s, so I wasn't really a threat to anybody. Plus, I don't come across that much as an academic. So it was like I was no threat. And they would say, "Well, yeah, that's Studs Terkel." He goes, I'd love to be a best-selling author, this or that, like Terkel, but he's an anecdotal kind of guy. And I thought, anecdotal? What are they talking about? And later, as I did my homework, a friend of mine who I went to high school with wrote Studs Terkel's biography. And it turns out that Studs Terkel had a PhD. This gruff old guy was really a scholar.
Right. The elitism and the sort of stuffy conventions of academics are interesting in that some academics don't feel like they need to develop the kind of communications techniques and strategies that can appeal to actual normal people.
Yes.
And many of them wind up just talking to each other.
Yes.
Which, of course, does no good for anybody if you have these highly theoretical academic people communicating in their own specialized language and jargon.
Going to conferences are funded by this society or that society.
Trading papers that they put in anthologies and get their publication credits and get their promotions and their tenure. And what have they really done? I don't know. But speaking of actually doing things, I want you to talk about the Asia America Initiative and your work in the Philippines.
Okay.
Since General Lansdale correctly predicted that that's where you would wind up, maybe you could talk about it.
Well, I think with Lansdale, he just had this inordinate sense of not seeing through people, but seeing into people. And in that regard, he was one incredible teacher in the school of life, much like Studs Terkel. What was Studs Terkel's school? Well, he had a radio show on WGN, which is the largest radio station in the Midwest. In its day, it was the superstation. It covered many, many states, and his listening audience was vast. And you could hear him at night as far east as New York. Or not him, but WGN, the station. And the school of life is really an important part of who we are, even as academics, to put it to a practical purpose. So I had learned enough about, in Congress, working as a young senior advisor, because I was young 30, 40 years ago. And the role that I was in to various committee chairmen was as an investigator on authorizing committees or helping with policy. So if there'd be an issue, during that time, there were very few people either elected or on staff who were war veterans. And there were a handful of chairmen, like Floyd Spence of International Relations, who had been in World War II. There was Ben Gilman, who was our International Relations chairman, sailor in World War II in combat. Henry Hyde of Illinois. I don't know if he was intelligence or something like that, but he was always in Congress, like in charge of the black budget. And the guy who I really learned from, and I really had a deep sense of respect for, was Strom Thurmond of South Carolina, who in his 40s in World War II was a paratrooper. And he was involved in D-Day, in the gliders that went in first, on the hills that were on top of the Omaha beach. And, when I met him, he was in his 80s, or he stayed in Congress till almost 100 years old. And I would sometimes I'd be working on the differential between House and Senate versions of an authorizing bill or something like that. At that time, he was chairman of Armed Services, and I was kind of the go-to guy of the military personnel subcommittee chairman, who was Bob Dornan. And I just loved asking him questions. And he had the wisdom of, 1,000 years in office.
Right.
That he pretty much could give you insight into things that really helped a lot. And it helped a lot in terms of what I eventually did, where it was like, do I stay a ninja, working behind the scenes and being the eyes and ears for policy of senior policymakers? Or do I do something that would put me in more of utilizing the knowledge I've gained in study, the academic side, as well as the practitioner side? So after 9/11, I created Asia America Initiative after we thought we had won in Afghanistan. But being a Vietnam veteran, it didn't seem right. We weren't there yet. And I talked to I had a good friend who was U.S. Army Special Forces who was doing after-action interviews of Special Forces soldiers coming back to the States. And we were talking about their psychological state. How did they feel about this? What did they think? What are their questions? What are their misgivings? And it didn't seem right. So I thought it's going to take a long time. And I had been involved with Afghanistan since the early 1980s during the war with the Soviet Union. And the area that I was researching and reporting on was the chemical biological warfare that the Russians were using.
Right.
And
the bee feces.
Yeah.
Right. Remember that
Oh,
guy at
it
Harvard
wasn't-
who
yeah, it
said it
wasn't bee
wasn't chemical
feces.
weapons, it was bee pollen or something.
That was someone who had a stake in the CBW, Chemical Biological Weapons Treaty, which, just on paper it looked nice, but it didn't have any enforcement really.
So Al, you did a lot of work on Afghanistan, particularly starting during the Soviet invasion period, and then, but given that background of Afghanistan, somehow you wound up doing counterterrorism work in the Philippines. So how did that work?
Okay. The thing that happened with that period of time is that two of the longest standing areas of conflict in the world, in addition to the Middle East, were the Philippines, which had the war in the Muslim Mindanao area going on for 400 years, but especially since the 1970s. And I was assigned as part of the East Asia Subcommittee investigative. It was like a team in two of us. The chairman and I would go all over the place and look at situations that were unresolved. That was part of what we did. And the Philippines, I had become very, very familiar with and got to know a lot of the Christian and Muslim leaders. So I had this long-standing relationship with the leadership of the conflict there on both sides. The New People's Army, who were the legacy of the communists, no. They were in the mountains, and they were irreconcilable at that time. They were killing themselves. They were doing like a French Revolution. The revolution turns on itself. They were like mass murdering each other. But a good friend of mine, Nick Rowe, who was U.S. Army Special Forces, was assassinated during that time. So I felt a commitment to Nick also because he was a terrific guy. And in his memory, I kept up. That was part of it. The other part of it was I knew there was something that what Lansdale had told me was going to happen. It became very apparent in my involvement there. And at the same time with Afghanistan, I went to the Bonn, Germany UN conference that was supposed to be the end of the war in Afghanistan. But in Bonn, seeing that the international bureaucrats were giving billions of dollars to an unstable new government that no one even knew what the government did or what they were going to do, that was a formula for disaster. So I got to understand, talking to my friend Gunnar Sepp in U.S. Army Special Forces, who had a PhD in history from Harvard. So he wasn't just doing after-action reports kind of out of a sense of, okay, this is my job of the moment. But the idea of the oral history that he was learning from the returning soldiers was something that he and I could discuss. And I saw from that end the emotional side, experiential side. Even after X number of months, it was wearing down our soldiers. And then on top of it, going to the statecraft side of it, the international bureaucrats just saw this as an opportunity to be wasteful.
Right.
And the people from Afghanistan, hey, you put a pile of money on the table, it's like being in the carpet bazaar. They're going to take it. Okay, I'll bargain, I'll haggle with you. You can get this rug that my tribe had made. Maybe you can get it for 50 rupees, and then maybe let's hear what you got. Oh, you got a pile of gold? Wonderful.
Right.
We'll take 5,000 rupees. Okay, fair deal. And that seemed to be Afghanistan. It was going to go down the tubes. And I felt if I had formed an organization to try to do humanitarian work and developmental work to build peace, development for peace, it wasn't going to happen in an environment where there's no rule of law and where money is being thrown around by the bushes full. And so the new president of the Philippines, it was Gloria Macapagal Arroyo. I had known her since she was a senator. And she said, Al, you can come here. We could use you with your skills. And after the Bonn conference, I went back to her and I said, yeah, you got a deal. And I'll start from scratch. And here at IWP, there were people that went to work in the Bush administration. They got confirmed and let me have their office and said, you're going to be doing the work in the field. You need a place here so you're not spending a lot of money here on real estate or rent in Washington, so you can use those funds to do the Lord's work in the area of conflict. And we're happy to let you have our office. And that's what happened.
So what did you actually do on the ground in the Philippines?
Had to stop people from killing each other, one village at a time. So I felt the safest place and the most, where all basic human needs could come together. The most treasured part of any tribal society is the children. They needed a safe place to be, so I focused on the schools, especially the elementary schools, and started a school development program tied to public health, so that we were taking care of the physical needs of the kids. They weren't dying young, and so not so many women were dying in childbirth, etc. And at the same time, we could have models of excellent schools, and the kids would have a safe space. Now, people in one U.S. government agency, whose name I won't mention, had this idea that ungovernable territories was a cool thing, because you could put military there and nobody will question, and you can just do what you want to do because they're ungovernable. And I really felt that was a mistake, because if you have an ungovernable territory, there is no safety. And terrorism will spread. And if you have people like the Abu Sayyaf in the Philippines kidnapping tourists and cutting off their heads, they would bring them to the ungovernable territory. And it's also where they do their smuggling. It's where they would stockpile their weapons, and we had to stop it. So one school, one village. We called each school a family. Teachers, parents, and if we could find a not corrupt official, which was difficult, but everyone was together, and I learned that from Lansdale way back when, because that's the way he operated in the Philippines, and that's what he wanted to impress upon me. Philippines is family. People relate to families, whether you're in a Christian area, a mountain tribe area, or a Muslim area. Don't get caught up in bureaucracy, but be part of the family with sincerity, but also good sense, so you don't get your pocket picked every time, you turn around that somebody's got their hand looking for, well, I don't see the gold on the table, maybe. Right. Maybe he's got it in a pocket somewhere. So I learned very quickly those core issues.
Yes, the fact that you were doing this on the cheap, not landing with pallets of, dollars, hundreds, and, gold and whatnot, but not bringing money to it actually reduces the temptation for corruption.
It made it a wealthier program, because you dealt with the basic human needs in a way that people were accountable. And if they saw with the head of school that I would empower them by giving a grant to that school, then they had to answer to the community. And we held community meetings in every village. And I became good friends with the senior Muslim imam in Holo Sulu. And he would go with me. In fact, he'd come after me so that I'd get there. And he would walk in, 5 or 10 minutes behind me, make a grand gesture, oh, my brother, and kiss me on both cheeks. And he'd tell everybody, he's my guest. So if somebody killed me, they would be insulting him, because I was his guest.
Right.
So that also added to the peace dividend. And I was seen, even if everybody knew I wasn't a Muslim, I was part of the community. And it didn't matter that I was not formally a Muslim, but that I would treat everybody with respect. And in fact, the very first meeting I had when I arrived there in 2002. I didn't even have a computer here at IWP at that time in my empty office, as I was just starting to build, was the idea that the elder should be shown respect. And I learned that in Afghanistan. So again, the roads not taken, coming together. I learned dealing with the Afghans, and I learned it earlier with the Vietnamese. So I could see it was, when you're dealing with tribal and ancient people in cultures much older than yours, you treat the elders with respect, as if they're your own grandparent. And I would never do anything without first discussing it with the Ummah, what the Muslims call like what Christians here would call their parish group. I would sit down with the Ummah, all of whom were older men and women, and we would have a discussion on which direction to go in and how to hold people accountable.
So your approach to, we could call it a shaping operation, or use some of that sort of Pentagon speak. But in terms of trying to influence the society away from political violence and away from the temptation of terrorism, is a contrast to the, money-centric, get it done in a hurry, heavily bureaucratized approach that we've seen elsewhere. Yours was not expensive, took time, developed relationships, but let me ask you, is it more durable than the other approach?
Every situation is different. In some places, you could have a durable operation if everything is configured correctly and you're able to fit in and you can do an immediate cessation. I'll give you an example of this. The only outsider besides me and Holo at that time, and he really wasn't an outsider, but he had been in Pakistan and Afghanistan for a while, was one of Osama bin Laden's brothers-in-law. Bin Laden married a lot of girls from a lot of places, so he'd have those family connections. So it was my approach to family and his approach, the Arab approach to family. You marry in, boom, the relatives are your gunmen. And so one of his brother-in-laws was trying to win people over, and then there was me, the outsider, but with the support of the Grand Imam and the Ummah. And the very first shipment of desks, because most kids went to schools where there were no chairs, and they had to sit on the floor or the ground. And we started doing chairs in classrooms so the kids could feel human. And then, right near IWP here, 2 blocks from us, is the National Geographic Society, the headquarters of National Geographic magazine. And they have a lot of maps. So I went to the society and I said, this is what I'm doing. Can y'all please help me? I need maps. Because I want to put on the classroom, in every classroom, maps of the world so kids could see their island, which is like the edge of the universe, in comparison to the rest of the world. And no place is the end of the world. What I found is that any place you go on this planet, you're in the center of the world, not the end of it. And so I could show them, look, and here's Japan, here's like Taiwan, here's Indonesia right here, and Australia. And oh my God, you mean those places are close to us? Yeah, you're in the middle. You're not somewhere isolated. And taking them out of that isolation is important in their dignity and their identity. So it was pretty cool. So here at IWP, I had not only the good fortune of having office space, and of course the way that I gave back was by being a substitute or a occasional seminar provider for students, but also, I could use the friends we developed at National Geographic.
Right.
And they loved it, because this was right after 9/11. Everybody's emotional, and this was their way of being part of the war on terror.
So do you think that your work in the Philippines has had a long-lasting benefit?
I put it this way. When I first started there, the number one cause of death in the areas that I chose was GSW, gunshot wounds. was the number one. Now it's like diabetes, heart attacks, and mosquito-borne diseases. That's a real challenge now, and it is everywhere in the world, especially in the rural areas, is dealing with stagnant water and mosquitoes that pass along diseases. And that's what I'm focused a lot on now, is that type of public health issue as part of our process. But if you look at, I've been there now, that was 2002, this is 22 years. And for the first 2 years ago, last year, for the first time, a school from our area was chosen among the top 10 schools in the entire country.
Fantastic.
Because the whole community worked together. And of course, our role was helping with books, maps, and learning tools. But the commitment and the skill and the expertise in terms of having some very good, caring, loving elementary teachers, all local.
That's amazing. So translating this experience to IWP, into teaching, because here, as you know, what we're trying to do is prepare our students for what they do after school. It's not just come here, check a block, get your piece of paper, and leave. We want people to go out and actually do things, to enter, whether it's in government, somewhere in the national security area, maybe the intelligence community, or if it's in the private sector, it might be contracting world, it might be the development world. It could be a lot of things. But the focus here really is on getting students to prepare for that kind of productive life. So how do you translate your experience through the classroom into helping with this educational mission?
I incorporate keeping journals. So every week, students look inside of themselves and write down what they're learning or what they're discovering. And that's part of their final grade. I encourage them to be part of the learning process, starting first step that, yes, we're reading some very interesting, fun books. We're watching movies like Seven Samurai, which is a great movie, but the journal is most important because they're learning to accept themselves and to find things that they didn't realize were actually there, which enhances who they become as a professional. And that's the instinctive side of being in war. And then after war, how do you come to terms from being in a traumatic environment with coping and living? I can't say our environment these days is not traumatic, because we're going through a lot of chaos right now and everything. But even to eventually overcome that chaos and self-doubt that we're having post-COVID and the political stuff that's going on now, I think to have a sense of introspection, I would not try to impose what people should believe. But the idea is to get in touch with what you believe and also to learn to see yourself, not to be afraid to look in the mirror. And for statecraft, for diplomacy, for creating treaties that have some lasting impact, all of that is absolutely critical. And that's where that pyramid of human needs of like Maslow, if I put it into a secular psychiatry term, and it doesn't matter what religion I am, and I do believe in God. The bottom line is I believe in God in a way that I accept people as my brothers and sisters. And again, the idea of family, the same way, incidentally, the first truck that came in bringing the chairs got bombed. Somebody put a IED underneath it. Fortunately, it was armored, and they couldn't destroy the books. And yes, it's like, that was like a sign to everyone that we weren't going to quit, and we would use our heads, we would protect things. And it also drew the military, local military, into a better relationship with the people. And it also is that my adversary directly was bin Laden's brother-in-law. I could show that I am not going to pick up a gun. This is what John Lenchowski calls, was it winning without fighting?
Yeah, winning without war.
Winning without war.
Yeah.
The war of ideas.
Right.
The war of the heart. Which isn't really a war, and that then transcends the whole process. So it's like with martial arts. You get your first black belt, and it's about what is your physical skill, and do you remember what's necessary to break something. When you're working on fixing something and not breaking it, it's about character.
Right.
And it's about using a not a soft touch, but you're using your power in a transformative way. You're dealing with the head and the heart, right? It's good that you know the physical strength, and you have the physical strength, but the head and the heart determine what kind of a master, what kind of a sensei, if you're a Japanese Aikido. I started with Aikido and my martial arts stuff. And I loved Aikido because the same thing. You were subduing. You didn't have to break somebody's arm, but you knew the pressure points and to subdue them. And if I'm a teacher dealing with rowdy kids, it's not my role to beat them up. And if somebody is rough physically, and I usually wind up in places where people are a bit feisty, I want to know how to calm them down, not to try to break them.
Right. Well, yeah, you're not talking about IWP so much. That's more the Philippines, right?
Not at IWP.
Or is it IWP? We have some rowdy students?
Nah, not that rowdy. But here it's about what is the difference, I think, these days from being a contractor and being a person who just loves their country. It's not that you take money totally out of the equation, but everyone is accountable, and including for your attitude, which is the whole idea of introspection. Because what concerned me in this contractor's direction that we're seeing a lot of our government going in is it creates corruption. And it creates corruption of the spirit even more than just corruption of how much money can I get. And we want, in my students, and I know that most of the professors here feel the same way, we want people of good character, and we want our school to have a reputation for producing quality professionals with very good character.
Very well said, Al. Well, thank you for coming on the podcast
Yes.
today. It's great to see you, and
Yeah.
thanks for everything you said.
Oh, you're welcome, Jim. And it's my pleasure, and it's been an honor to be part of the IWP family.
Couldn't do it without you.